Good afternoon. My name is JJ Spoon, and I'm an associate professor of political science and director of the Center for European Studies here at Pitt. Today's conversation on Europe is 100 Years of Women's Suffrage, Women in Europe Today. Today's conversation is sponsored by the European Studies Center and the University Center for International Studies and supported by the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. It's part of our Year of Global Europe program. Our co-sponsors who are joining us remotely are the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at Florida International University and the European Union Center at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Thank you to our ESC staff members, Iris Matievich, who's here with us, and Katie Brown for their help in organizing today's event. Our next conversation on Europe is on a completely different topic, on World's Fairs and International Expositions. So please join us for that on October 16th at noon. So to get us started today, 2018 marks the 100th anniversary of the expansion of suffrage to some women in the United Kingdom. Women over the age of 30 who owned property or who were the wives of property owners were given the vote. It, however, took until 1928 for women to be granted the same suffrage as men. The age was lowered to 21 and property qualifications were lifted. Although women were granted the vote in some European countries earlier in the century, Finland and Norway extended suffrage to women in 1906 and 1907, respectively, and some did not receive the vote until much later. French women, for example, did not have the vote until 1944, and it wasn't until 1971 that Swiss women won this right. We use the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage in the UK as a marker to reflect on women's participation in politics and society in Europe over the last century. Today, we will ask how far women have come over this period and how far they still have to go to reach parity in numbers and influence in politics, civil society, and the corporate world. To discuss these issues, I'm joined today by three esteemed scholars of women's history and gender in politics. First, to my right, is my colleague, Melanie Hughes, who is professor of sociology at the University of Pittsburgh. She received her PhD from the Ohio State University. Her work focuses on the study of gender and politics across countries. She's particularly interested in the ways that gender intersects with other forces of marginalization to influence women's political power. Dr. Hughes has collaborated with the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, and the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, to increase the availability of data on gender equality in political leadership and public administration. She is the founder and co-director of the Gender Inequality Research Lab, or GIRL, at Pitt, and is the deputy editor of Gender and Society. Her work has been published in many journals, including the American Sociological Review, American Political Science Review, and Social Forces. Dr. Hughes is the author of Women, Politics, and Power, A Global Perspective, which is now in its third edition. Welcome.
Thank you.
And I'm joined by two colleagues remotely. First, Karen Offen is a historian and independent scholar affiliated as a senior scholar with the Michelle R. Klayman Institute for Gender Research at Stanford University. She received her PhD from Stanford as well. Her work focuses on the history of modern Europe, especially France and its global influence, Western thought and politics with reference to family, gender, and relative status of women, women's history, and the national, regional, and global histories of feminism and comparative history. Dr. Offen is a founder and past secretary-treasurer of the International Federation for Research in Women's History, and is past president of the Western Association of Women Historians. She's directed 4 interdisciplinary NEH summer seminars for college teachers on the woman question. Her recent books include Globalizing Feminisms, 1789 to 1945, Debating the Woman Question in the French Third Republic, 1870 to 1920, published by Cambridge. We are also joined by Nora Crook, who is a professor of political science at Rutgers University. She received her PhD from Columbia University. Her research focuses broadly on the participation of women. Dr. Crook's work has examined representation, candidate selection, electoral reform, and violence and harassment against women in politics, among other topics. She has served as a consultant for a variety of civil society organizations, governments, and international organizations in Asia, Africa, Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East on strategies to elect more women to political office and enhance the impact of female politicians. And she is the co-convener of Feminism and Institutionalism, the International Network on Feminism and Institutionalism. Dr. Crook is the author or co-author of several books, including Quotas for Women in Politics, Gender and Candidate Selection Reform Worldwide, and the Gender Quotas and Women's Representation, New Directions in Research. Her work has also been published in many journals, including Comparative Political Studies, Politics and Gender, and Journal of Politics. So welcome to all three of you. So we have lots to talk about today, and so I thought we should start by talking a bit more in depth about the history of women's suffrage in Europe. Obviously, I gave us a bit of an introduction, but I thought we could start talking about where sort of the movement started. And what were some of the arguments used to mobilize the population? Karen, would you like to start with that?
Oh, where did it start? Quite a long time ago.
Yeah.
I've just been writing about 600 years of his debate on the women question in France. And suffrage only comes into that debate with the French Revolution, of course, and the end of the monarchy, or at least the temporary ends of the monarchy. But one of the particularly interesting features is that in 1848, the French Second Republic enfranchised all the men, and they called that universal suffrage. That became a bone of contention, as you can imagine, and there were women in Paris who were contesting that at that very time. Now, it's interesting, too, that the Swiss also enfranchised all men in 1848. And perhaps it's noteworthy that France and Switzerland were two of the last countries to enfranchise women on the same terms. I think you can figure out why that might be. Okay, so the suffrage campaigns really were beginning in 1848, but the results of universal manhood suffrage in France did not end well, and the men all voted for Louis Napoleon to be the president of the Second Republic. Eventually there was a coup d'etat, and lo and behold, they were back to monarchy. So when the Third Republic was established there, they were very suspicious about adding any more people to the mix, much less women. And this became a bone of contention for the next 50 years or so. In the meantime, as you mentioned, the Finns enfranchised women and men at the same time in 1906. And it was Norway came in stages thereafter, but it's really only in the last part of the 1910s or toward 1910 that you find major suffrage campaigns evolving. In England, of course, we know about the WSPU and the NUWSS, the Pancos, and the big rallies in London. That was the most media-savvy campaign that's ever been run by women for anything. And it became the measure of what a campaign for suffrage would look like. The French didn't go that route. They thought, because of their contacts in the legislature and in government more generally, that they could pull the campaign for suffrage off simply by working on the Chamber of Deputies and the various ministries and being much more, I wouldn't say circumspect, because they were very direct in the way they went about it, but they also believed that women should be acting like ladies. And so they were, shall we say, using their feminine charms to convince people that women would be a great addition to the French electorate. At the same time, there's a campaign for proportional representation going on, which kept getting in the way of discussing the female vote. And I'll skip over a lot of things that we can come back to later, such as the build-up right before in 1914, which was totally crushed by the war breaking out in early August. And ultimately, in 1919, following the British enfranchisement of women over 30, the French Chamber of Deputies went further still and voted to enfranchise all women without restriction by a vote of 344 to 47. However, there was the Senate to contend with, and that's another story, which I can elaborate on a little bit later.
Okay, well, thank you. I think that gives us a good introduction to some of the issues that were going on, especially in France. Mona, do you want to perhaps jump in and talk a bit about what was going on in the Nordic countries even earlier than in the UK and other places?
Yeah, so I guess the context for this is that I've been studying women in Nordic politics for a number of years. But I've also just finished editing a book. It's going to come out in early 2019. It's going to be called the Palgrave Global Handbook on Women's Political Rights, and it looks at both the spread of suffrage and the impact of women's suffrage, as well as the spread of mechanisms to increase women's political representation. So thinking both about the right to run for office as well as the right to vote. And yeah, Finland is actually quite an interesting case because this is during the period of the time when Finland is part of the Russian Empire. It's an autonomous Grand Duchy. So it's actually quite an interesting question. Why is it, the first country to enfranchise both men and women at the same time? It's actually the first country where women have the right to run for office on equal terms with men. And in fact, in 1907, there were more than 10% women elected to the Finnish Parliament, which is a level that was not achieved by the United States Congress until the 1990s, just to sort of put it in that sort of context. And a lot of it, I think, had to do with women's mobilization. There was very strong women's movement pushing for it. But there was also, I think, recognition on the part of different movements that were organized by men, the peasants movement, for example, that really, also embraced this and didn't see a contradiction that maybe countries like France saw between women's citizenship and men's citizenship, and has a lot to do with other features of the society. You don't have a sort of a nobility, you don't have other divisions that might have sort of idealized the sort of very separate roles for men and women.
Thank you. No, I think that gives us a really interesting sort of contrast, especially in the French and the Finnish cases. I wonder if we could talk a bit, and whoever wants to maybe jump in on this, to talk a bit about kind of how perhaps some of these movements for suffrage connected across different countries. We talk now about sort of transnational, international, movements, which we'll talk a bit about later as well. But I wonder, was there some kind of connections going on even 100 years ago?
Okay, yeah. There's actually quite a lot of. I don't know who wants to jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
But no, I was gonna.
Excuse me a minute.
Is it okay? Oh, sure. Yeah, no, actually, it's one of the really important aspects of understanding, feminism, is that it's always been global and transnational, right? It's never been something that's only been going on in one country. And if you look at, the spread of, if you want to just go back to the Nordic countries, there were a lot of interconnections between the movements in those countries, so that there was the sharing of ideas. And so we see that happening in terms of women's suffrage as well as women's right to run for a political office. And I think that's a really crucial part of why we see such advances in those countries in both both aspects of women's political rights. But of course, in the early days, it was largely connections amongst European and North American feminists. But it becomes also a really crucial part of the spread of suffrage across countries of Latin America. Really, the Organization of American States played a huge role, the Inter-American Commission of Women, in sort of, kind of connecting the women to share the ideas and to share strategies for promoting women's political rights.
Yeah, so we know that there were a range of early political conferences that women participated in, mostly from European countries, especially in the early days, that were important points for women to network. But women were also outside of these spaces aware of what sorts of campaigns were happening in other places, for sure. And especially that was true of some of the most visible campaigns. And we do see transnational linkages and learning. So especially there's a lot of documentation that women in the US, for example, took a lot from the British campaigns in terms of how they should be proceeding, and some of the militancy that started happening in American suffrage movements can really be traced to some of the things that were unfolding in the British suffrage movements earlier on. So I think we can look at it as both there were these particular moments in which activists kind of came together in time and talked about things, but also just, that movements were paying attention to one another. And there were women who were traveling to and around Europe at this time and sort of taking back to their own national movements things that they learned elsewhere.
Karen, did you want to add anything?
I should say a few words about the International Women's Suffrage Alliance, which came together in 1904. And that group really grew out of the International Council of Women, which had been established somewhat earlier in 1888 at the initiative of the American suffragists. But the International Council of Women was not so much focused on the vote. So a certain number of its members thought that there should be a special organization working side by side to focus on the vote internationally. And this group met annually. The first meeting was in Berlin, then they met in Amsterdam, various other places, Stockholm, London. And this did achieve a bringing together of suffragists from many different parts of Europe, certainly, and the Americas. Only later did it then involve women from other countries. The interesting thing about the International Women's Suffrage Alliance, though, to me, is the fact that because of their discussions, they realized how many different approaches there could be to getting suffrage. Just one example, California enfranchised the women of California, my state, by referendum. It was an all-male referendum in 1911. And the United States, in particular, had a crazy situation because it was going state by state. The states, because it was written in the Constitution that the states would control who votes. And so they were running multiple campaigns at the same time, whereas in a place like France, this decision would be made by the legislature, the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate. So very different tactics are required. And this varied from one place to another. The Finnish case is interesting because it was more or less given by the Tsar as part of the number of other reforms that for the Grand Duchy at that time. So every situation was different. The Swiss was particularly difficult because not only was it state by state, but it was canton by canton. And therefore, it took a lot longer. Let's see, what else can we say about that? The International Suffrage Alliance lasted for quite a long time. Ultimately, in 1926, when a number of countries had enfranchised the women, it changed its name and its mission to focusing on citizenship and the practices of citizenship, as well as the continued fight for the vote in other places.
Melanie, I want to follow up on something you said. The image of women going back and forth between the US and the UK is really sort of fascinating and time period. And I wonder if you or anyone else wants to jump in too, as well, talk perhaps a little bit more about perhaps some of these interactions and the kinds of tactics that were shared sort of transnationally at this time that we started to see being used in various places.
Yeah, I mean, what I know the most about is the militancy. So the British suffrage movement is probably best known for this particular aspect of the movement. There was really no other movement that was as militant as the British. And they engaged in a wide range of tactics in order to bring attention to the fight for women's suffrage, from basically breaking windows to all sorts of resistance. There were women who were trying to resist the census taking. There were even some, an unfortunate high-profile case of a woman committing suicide publicly. So there were all of these things that were sort of going on, and women getting arrested and beaten up by the police, who were actually actively working to try to stop the women from these behaviors by being violent when they arrested them, through practices they called buffeting. So they had arrested all of these suffragettes, and the women were also engaging in campaigns where they were refusing to eat, and they were being ultimately force-fed. And so all of these things were extremely public, and there were women and sort of connections from women in the US movements who believed that maybe this was a way to draw attention to the activities within the US. So this, of course, caused some divisions within the movement, because not everybody agreed in the UK, and certainly not everybody agreed in the US either, about what the appropriate tactics were for bringing attention to the movement. And I think, speaking to sort of what Karen was talking about, there were women within the movement who felt like it was very important to sort of be ladies. And even the idea of a like walking march was something that some women really felt uncomfortable with. So you have to think about that as just that public act of walking in public for suffrage was considered radical at the time. But women increasingly saw this as a way to bring attention to their issue and their cause, and they pulled some of these tactics really across the ocean.
Karen or Mona, do you want to add any other examples or any other?
No, I think that is, a reasonable assessment of the situation. I think the unique thing in the case of the British was bringing in the working women, the huge contingent of working women, and this point was made very clear in this relatively new film called The Suffragette, which, if anyone hasn't seen it, it's an absolute must. It came out a year or two ago and was circulating even in the art theaters here in this country.
Mona, are there any other, sort of anything else that you can sort of think of, in terms of kind of the tactics, how things perhaps look different in Finland and Norway and some of the, Scandinavian countries in terms of what the movement looked like, how sharing of practices was happening?
Mm-hmm. Another piece of the equation.
Sorry, Karen, that was for Mona. Mona, go ahead.
Oh, that's fine. Actually, I defer to Karen if she's.
It's a bit of a delay in the sound. So whoever wants to respond to that.
Karen, you can.
Karen, would you like to jump in? Go for it.
You see, another piece of the story about Europe in particular is that after the World War, a number of the new countries, in this case, Germany, the Weimar Republic, Austria, Czechoslovakia, enfranchised women more or less without there being a campaign. And they just thought it was the right thing to do. But the problem with that was that in some cases, the women weren't too interested there because they hadn't really had their political consciousnesses raised. And that created some problems down the line. It's a very different thing when your government just hands you the vote, as opposed to working for it.
So, I think that's one of the really important points to make. I think Karen said there was such a diversity of ways in which suffrage actually unfolded in different countries. And we also know that it's really hard to say what worked, right? It happened in so many different ways and across different time periods. But I think there's at least two things that we can say mattered. One in the negative, which generally speaking, there's really no evidence to suggest that militants helped either of the movements that engaged in those practices. And if anything, some scholars would argue that like large and loud movements slowed down the process and generated some greater resistance. So it's not necessarily a positive story for those of us who may care about agitating. And I think the other point to make, and that's come up a little bit so far, is the importance of conflicts, of wars, loom very largely in many of the stories that we're thinking about in Europe. Certainly, World War I, its beginning was a real difficult moment for many of the active suffrage movements at the time because they basically had to stop what they were doing and get on board with war. But once the World War I was over, you did see this wave of suffrage. And then again, after World War II, there was another wave of countries that were getting suffrage. And you can also see some countries in which the war led partial suffrage to happen. So Belgium is an example where widows and mothers of fallen soldiers and also women political prisoners were actually given the right to vote in 1919, but women didn't gain universal suffrage until 1948 after World War II. So it's also true that sometimes a revolution within a country mattered. That was true in the Portuguese case, where suffrage to women came after a revolution. And we can also see some of these internal negotiations. So potentially part of the story with Finland was because, the Russian regime really kind of wanted to keep its relationship with Finland in some ways the way that it was. So some people will argue that Finland's not the first country to give women suffrage because it technically wasn't an independent country at that time.
So I want to talk perhaps a bit about, in my mind, two really interesting cases in the history of suffrage in Europe. One, France, and Karen, I'd like you to return to some of the things you mentioned and talk about, trying to help us to understand why French women didn't get the vote until 1944 after the war. And obviously there were other countries, we just heard about Belgium as well. And then of course the case that I always find most fascinating, which is Switzerland. And of course, when I always tell my students that women in Switzerland didn't get the right to vote until 1971, they're shocked. And so if anyone feels comfortable talking a bit more about sort of what was going on in Switzerland, I think that would be real interesting. So Karen, do you want to maybe start with France and then we can go from there and just help us to understand, all of your research, for example, on the Third Republic, what has that helped us to really learn about, why women didn't get the right to vote until nearly the end of World War II?
The question in French, they put it as le retard, the delay. And there was a delay that was recognized by everyone. But if you start looking at this in the broader scheme of things, it was only 30 years. And there are some interesting factors that get invoked. One of them is that the secular Republicans were worried that Catholic women would vote and essentially join what was early on a monarchist opposition and bring an end to the Republic. That was fairly serious in people's minds. However, the Catholics were worried about the secular women doing the opposite and being mean to the church, put it in a simple-minded way. The factor that was not really talked about in the scholarly literature, but which became glaringly evident when I was working on suffrage, is the demographics. women in France, adult women, outnumbered men, at least from the 1890s on. And after the war, they outnumbered them even more. And we're talking like millions. There was a certain concern there that there would be a sort of female coalition, which would pass laws that were, of course, very nice for the women, but would eat into men's privileges. That is a very powerful piece of it. It wasn't discussed so much by the scholars, but it was very alive and well in the debates at the time. What are we going to do with this, potential female majority? That made a huge difference, I think, in the thinking of the men who were considering whether they should enfranchise women. And it played out particularly in the French Senate, which even after the Chamber of Deputies ratified universal women's suffrage in May 1919, refused in the subsequent term to even bring this issue to the table. They never discussed it. They wouldn't even take it up, despite tremendous pressure from the women suffragists in the legislature. They wouldn't touch it. And then they would invoke various things, and the religious issue was certainly an important one, but it probably wasn't the most important. I think that's what's distinctive. The other thing that is really fascinating is the attitude of the French women who were working on suffrage. I just want to read you one quote from my book on the debates. I just had the page a few minutes ago. Let's see if I can find it again. Yeah, here we go. The Chamber of Deputies has understood that the daughters of the French Republic should not and cannot be put in the same class as minors, criminals, and the incompetent. The Chamber has understood our humiliation in face of the women of the entire world who almost all now have the vote, while our country still seems to lack confidence in us. We are certain that all true Democrats are on our side. There's this way of using history and the power of the daughters of the revolution that comes up again and again in their arguments. And it's in some ways related to the kind of stance that Elizabeth Cady Stanton took in 1869 in the U.S. when she was railing against essentially the same thing, only in that case it was the immigrants and the immigrant men who were being enfranchised. And it was very elitist fundamentally, but it was also a very powerful argument in the circumstances of the time. And the French debate everything, but in this particular, they have a very interesting way of doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Mona Romney, if you want to add anything to the French case or pick up on Switzerland, if either one of you want.
I'm happy to say a few things about Switzerland. I don't know a ton about the case, but I think what's really interesting is that we think about the Swiss case as being very late in waiting till 1971, but in fact, Switzerland had a law that allowed their cantons to make choices about what was going to happen. So it was like basically, the decisions about voting could be made at the canton level. And so even in 1971, where there became suffrage at the federal level, there were still cantons that were not allowing women to vote. And it in fact wasn't until 1990 that the last canton actually was forced by the courts to allow women to vote. So they had repeatedly refused to have the vote. There were 2 German cantons that were basically making the argument that we like the way that things are, we're not going to change things. And finally, the the government went in and said that there was a court decision that basically said that they just had to let women vote. So,
and this was both could they vote at the local level?
They could already vote at the federal level, right?
Okay.
So in 71, everybody could vote in federal elections.
Okay.
But basically, oftentimes we saw it go the other way around, where sometimes women have local rights to vote before the national campaigns give them rights at the federal level. And the Swiss case is so interesting because there was federal voting rights in 71, but there were still some places in Switzerland where women could vote in local elections until 1990.
Wow. That's really, I did not know that. That's actually really interesting. Moto, do you want to add anything to either of these cases or any tried to get in a couple times? We've had a little bit of technical delay here, so.
No, that's fine. I would just add the fact that there's a wonderful analysis by Pam Paxton on the timeline of women's suffrage, and I think it's just fascinating. You know, I often think about countries like Switzerland or France or Greece, right, as sort of birthplace of democracy, and these are some of the last countries to enfranchise women, and you know, so Paxton goes through and looks at the years when men were granted the right to vote, right, which is usually the timeline that political scientists and sociologists use to sort of date the age of democracy. But if you actually look at true universal suffrage, which is when women and men both have the right to vote, you get a really different idea about how old these democracies are, right? And I think that really focusing on women's suffrage provides an important corrective to how we think about, you know, some of these really, really core concepts like democracy and equality and representation. And I think it, you know, just calls into question a lot of like a very, very large literature, you know, in social sciences about, you know, political life, because we have tended to think about universal suffrage in terms of just universal male suffrage. Just insert that.
I think, thank you for bringing that up, because I think that is really important to keep in mind when we're talking about, you know, exactly sort of the timeline of democracy, or when countries sort of democratized, and sort of all of the caveats that kind of come with that, and that until we have, you know, we reach the point of universal suffrage, which, you know, even in some countries after women got the vote, of course, there are other groups that got the vote later. As we know, obviously in the U.S. is an example of that in terms of full suffrage for African Americans. And so I think that's a very important point to make in terms of sort of that history of democratization or countries becoming full democracies. So I think.
Can I say one more thing? I think what's really interesting too is we can think about that in terms of the later stages, but you can also go back early on and think about what norms of what a citizen was and early on. And I think one of the fascinating things about early suffrage movements is that in some of these places, women actually did vote before their rights were taken away, because the countries wrote the laws in ways that were universal, thinking that universal just was men. But then the women would contest it, saying, well, it's just written to include all people. And so then the governments would actually have to act to take the rights away from women, saying, no, when we said citizen, we actually were talking about men. And then there was like the fight to get back, to basically say, no, women are citizens. But we think about it now, it's like, well, of course women are citizens, right? We can't imagine anything else. But if you think back to that time, the idea of women being citizens was even itself so unthinkable that people writing the laws didn't even consider it.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point. I want to take a time now to see if there's any questions, since we have sort of kind of two parts to this conversation, the historical part, which of course we could continue talking for quite a while, but I want to have some time to talk about the current situation. So I want to give everyone a chance, if there are any questions from anyone in the room here or from our partner institutions that are joining us remotely, that focused on sort of these historical topics that we've been talking about.
One observation of it, along with the film about women's suffrage in England, there's a new recent film called Divine Order about women's suffrage in Switzerland. And it's
take note.
It's a lovely film. It's fun, quite entertaining.
Is it Swiss?
Yes, and well worth we could try and screen that.
Yeah.
But I actually, Karen, I wanted to, if you'll excuse me, return to the observation that you made about, in effect, Germany and the Eastern European states, because I'm intrigued by that. Certainly one of the things that wound up happening is after the 1918 revolutions, the SPD comes to power in Germany, and there had been attempts or intensifications of the promise to give women suffrage during the war on the part of the monarchy as a way of intensifying women's commitment to the war cause. And in fact, women were much more nationally oriented than the men. The men who were returning from the front were told by the women to go back and fight like brave men should. And so one of the things you said, though, is that the women received the vote without preparation by the state. And we know that one of the things that winds up happening in Germany, and I think that's what you were alluding to, is that as soon as universal suffrage is declared, women vote largely in a conservative fashion, centered to the right and even the far right. And as a result, the SPD never regains its absolute majority. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate on your assessment there, because it seems interesting to me if you're maintaining that the state was responsible for preparing women to vote, because there were certainly long histories since 1848, Louisa Aston and a number of figures leading women's suffrage movements in Germany. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that point that you were making.
The German situation is less well understood by me, but I'll try and give it a shot. I think that one of the big differences between the German situation, especially in the imperial time, is that the voting itself had a two-tiered arrangement. It wasn't a direct vote for representatives, but you voted for the people who would vote for the representatives. Now, in the Weimar situation, the Germans also had a demographic problem because of the war. And there were, again, a majority of women, adult women, relative to adult men. One of the charges that was made in the earlier times was that it was essentially the women who voted in the Nazis. But in fact, the people who have studied that and looked at that will say that isn't the case. What was the case, though, was that women were a majority in virtually every political party that formed in Weimar Germany. And so the parties made a rather severe effort to try and control them and to channel them. Now it's a complicated story, but well, let's see, what else can I say about that? The practice of democracy, the practice of citizenship, takes a little learning. And if people are fundamentally not interested or novices, it takes a while before a democracy can really begin to function.
Can I add that it also takes, there's often some forgetting?
Women who are having plenty of experience organizing, being involved in the public sphere, in the press. There was a heightened concern about the way politics was run and the way that elected officials operated. In other countries, not so much. And we've seen that in some ways play out in some of the countries where the franchise has come to both women and men in rather later fashion. But let's see. I think that's about what I can say.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think there's so much here we could talk for an hour and a half about every single point. Are there any other questions on sort of what we've been talking about from anyone here or?
Well, just generally, I was wondering if anyone could talk to if there's a gap between when a country authorized women's suffrage and when women are allowed to hold office? Is that generally the same thing, or is there generally a gap there?
Mona, do you want to pick up on that?
Sometimes those things come together and sometimes not.
Yeah. Mona, do you want to?
Yeah, no, exactly. I think we do have cases where sometimes we get the right to run for office, but not the right to vote. And sometimes we have the cases where they get the right to vote, but not the right to run for office. So in the early years, it didn't necessarily coincide. Yeah, I think the Finnish case is, to my knowledge, the first one where they, are coinciding. But what we see is that as it becomes more of a norm in the international system, those things come together, right? So it's sort of something that starts to align sort of towards the middle of the 20th century.
Well, I want to turn now, so we have time to talk about sort of, fast forward to today, and where women have had the right to vote for anywhere from, well, in the case of Switzerland, 30 years, to well over 100. But we've had, obviously there's quite a range there. But to talk a bit about sort of the state of women's participation in Europe more generally, and obviously, of course, we know there are differences between sort of Eastern Europe, Western Europe, etc. So there's a lot of ground to cover. But Mona, maybe we'll start with you, and since you're working on a project right now, just looking at participation, and just maybe kind of give us a broad kind of overview of kind of the state of women's participation before we get into some specifics.
So in terms of, just to sort of set the global context, if we look at the global average of women in parliaments, it's around 23% now, and the European average is slightly above that, and it's second highest regional average in the world in terms of women's political representation. It's just slightly behind the Americas in terms of the share of women. And if we look across the region, of course, there are very important differences. But one of the interesting things is that there was a whole lot of diversity, and I think there's been more convergence over the last couple of decades in terms of women's political participation, and that's because of the widespread diffusion of different types of electoral gender quotas to compel political parties to nominate more women than they would have done in the past. And a lot of those quotas first started as party measures, but the countries and this had tended to be countries where there were already more women in politics, but some of the countries that had traditionally low levels of female representation started to adopt national laws that applied to all political parties, requiring them to nominate more, greater numbers of women to as candidates to parliament. So we start to see big increases in parts of the region where that hadn't traditionally been the case. And I guess a really good example of that, and we keep coming back to this country of France, that in 1999 they reformed their constitution, and then 2000 and they reformed their electoral law to require that there be 50% female candidates to all levels, almost every single type of political office. A few were excluded, like mayors and other things like that. And now there's been, at the beginning, it wasn't as effective of a law, but increasingly the share of women's has gone up. In the last election, it's now more than 40% women, where the starting point was about 50% women. So it's over time become a much more effective law. So I think that's really an important part of the explanation. In Eastern Europe, there's been it's been a slower a slower path to change, and that has a lot to do with the communist legacy that during the communist period, there were lots of formal and informal quotas for women. So with the fall of communism, you saw a huge collapse in the share of women in elected positions. But slowly, more and more countries have been introducing quotas of various types, usually quota laws. And so we're starting to see some of the gains that, it's sort of a very similar process that's happening as the quotas get more mature. We're starting to see more and more women elected. And the first countries in Eastern Europe that really started to take steps in this regard were the Balkan countries, with the collapse of the former Yugoslavia. But that intersects, I think, very interestingly with Melanie's work on post-conflict countries, because, of course, they are also post-conflict countries, or they're in a post-conflict region. And so I think that's why, as sort of a set of countries, they were ahead of other countries in the eastern part of Europe to start making some of those changes.
So I wonder if Mona or Melanie, whoever wants to jump in on this, that quotas are, I'm sure, not without controversy, right? Both on sort of the implementation and also on the effect. And so I wonder if we could talk a bit about sort of some of the discussion that surrounding the implementation of the quotas, and sort of what perhaps some of the pushback may have been, and then also let's talk about it first, and then we can talk about sort of the outcomes. So whoever would like to take that.
I'll defer to Mona since she basically wrote the book on it.
All right. I mean, there are a lot of objections to a lot of objections to gender quotas that we've heard over the years, and all different kinds of arguments made. For example, that they undermine merit and candidate selection, that they will potentially hurt the political party because you end up getting poor candidates. But that is an argument that I think has been pretty decisively been disproven, that quotas have really managed to bring in women who are equally or more qualified than the men that they are replacing. But I think that one of the really key issues we're seeing globally has a lot to do, and I think this also is an important new addition to the suffrage discussion as well, and in academic literature, which is men's own interest in blocking change, right? Because in the case of suffrage, right, that adding a huge number of new voters is potentially going to change the partisan balance, right? The voter outcomes, the electoral outcomes. When it comes to gender quotas, if the quotas work, then in theory, many of the men who are voting for the reform, supporting the reform, may also be losing their seats as a result. So I think that's a really, really important part of that discussion, right? It's like these very practical aspects, which are not about the normative questions of empowering women, but really about the normal political power struggles we see around a lot of other issues. And in terms of if we take the case of party quotas, which are very common, probably the most common measure used across Western Europe in particular, a lot of it is people have explained their introduction in terms of seeking political advantage, right? Parties adopt quotas because they think it's going to help them with female voters, right? So it sort of links back to the voter question, that it's going to make their party seem more women friendly, that it's going to activate the female, support base within their own ranks as well. So again, they're empowering women, and in doing so, but it also, there's something that they gain. At least they perceive that they will gain by supporting these types of measures.
Are there any examples of either parties or legislatures, I suppose, that had quotas and then pulled them back? In other words, they didn't work out the way that they had hoped, and they had then basically gotten rid of them?
Well, it's interesting because in the international system, especially the United Nations system, they're known as temporary special measures. So the idea is that these are like temporary measures that like later will be taken away. But what we find is that many of the reforms are introduced by changes to party statutes, changes to constitutions, changes to electoral laws that are actually quite difficult to remove. But there are a couple of cases, notable cases, where they have been taken away. In Denmark, I think is probably the European case where it's, I guess, most notable, that most of the parties had adopted quotas, but then, especially in the for the left-wing parties, there was a movement by young women in the early 90s to remove the quotas because they felt that it was, it was kind of insulting to women, right? The idea that they would have to need some sort of special help or dispensation to be included. In other countries, it's been more like the quotas expired. In Uruguay, for example, it was only going to apply for one election, and then it wasn't going to apply, so they had to would have had to create a new reform in order to get it again. So in most cases, I would say that quotas have been adopted in a, at least permanent or semi-permanent fashion. And I think that's really, really important, I think, symbolically, to say that the political system is open and supportive of women's political participation.
Just to add to that, I think there are a few cases in which quotas have been outlawed by courts. So generally they're not retracted by legislatures because that's politically been quite difficult to say we're going to take the quota away once it's there. But what we do see is sometimes courts saying that they run counter to equality provisions in constitutions. And so then in some cases there are iterative processes where countries will go through constitutional reform so that they can adopt the quotas. But in some cases there can be a sizable gap. So sometimes you do see the kind of different institutions standing in the way of quotas, but not so much the sort of legislative, we're going to back off of this.
And in those cases, many of the quotas have then, subsequently seen the constitutional reform has then paved the way to reintroduce the quota, right? So the setback is often temporary in those cases.
Karen, did you want to add something?
I have a question for the political scientists, and that is, it's my impression that the quota system is pretty much restricted to cases where you're voting on party lists. In single member constituencies like we have in the United States, that's pretty hard to enforce. It doesn't really work there. And so in the US, going at it the other way by simply trying to get more women into these positions, but it's basically one by one. Is that the case that it's mostly or solely in cases where there are party lists that they can invoke quotas?
It's definitely a case that the quotas sort of come together with party list because it's clear how you would apply them. Globally, what's happened is that a lot of, for example, African countries where they have single member districts, they have introduced a system of reserved seats where they have specific, districts that are reserved for women. India also has a system in local government, but in European cases, I think the counterexample is the United Kingdom, where they obviously also have single member districts, and what the Labour Party has done is pledged that in 50% of its winnable seats, so places where there might be a member of parliament who's retiring, or they're pretty sure that they could capture it back, from the Conservatives or Lib Dems, they sort of identified their winnable seats and pledged to nominate at least 50% women to those seats. And so what we've seen also in the British case is that there's been a very remarkable climb in the number of women elected to the British Parliament, but the overwhelming majority of those women are Labour women. And it comes from that particular measure. It's also really interesting, the Liberal Democrats who have resisted quotas for many, many years, in their last party conference after, very embarrassing, set of electoral losses, where in one case where they elected no women at all, to Parliament, they realized they really need to do something more proactive. So they have also introduced a quota policy to govern the next elections. So it is possible. It just requires a different way of thinking about it, right? Looking at the electoral districts as a whole, and of course the French case as well. The parties must, based for Parliament, it's based on single member districts too, and they have to also look to their collection of districts across them. They're supposed to nominate 50% women and 50% men. What has happened in the French case is that you don't have a winnable seat provision, which has led political parties, especially the bigger parties, to nominate. For example, the Conservatives will put their female candidates in districts that are always won by socialists, and the socialists will always put their women in districts that are always won by conservatives. So you end up seeing a sort of distribution, or this was at least in the original set of provisions, is that if there's no requirement to that, you can just put in the districts you would never win anyways. And so that has been a challenge to the effective implementation, and that really has changed as parties have I think received some critique for not not respecting the quota in terms of that mobility aspect.
In terms of sort of challenges, and I want to talk a bit about sort of descriptive and substantive representation. As we know, descriptive representation is obviously that we increase the number of women in Parliament so that it balances out with the percentage of women in society. So descriptive equality, let's say, of women. But then perhaps the more interesting question is, do we have sort of substantive representation? In other words, by having more women in Parliament, is the debate changing? Is the nature of the debate? Is the legislation that we're seeing passed, is that different? And again, party plays a role in this also. And so I wonder, whoever wants to jump in and to start this conversation in terms of thinking about like the outcomes of these quotas.
I'll jump in there.
Okay.
I always say to people that there are sort of two answers to that question. And the first is that it doesn't matter if there's a link, right? There's sort of a human rights aspect to this, which is there should be more women in decision-making positions, regardless of whether or not they, make a difference, quote unquote, in politics. But the second answer is that empirically, it seems to be the case. And we know that, not all women, support feminist policy positions, for example, or would prioritize issues that are particularly important to women and in their work. But as you get more women, of course, there's likelihood that, one, that there might be more women who are, want to be entrepreneurial about that. And two, it gives them some of the strengths of numbers to really work together, right? Because it takes a lot of work to cultivate cultivate support around a particular bill. What is very challenging in the European context, of course, is that you have parliamentary systems. So individual parliamentarians, individual elected officials they're not really the ones who are proposing and voting on bills. There's a high level of party discipline in that respect. But there's some wonderful work by Diane O'Brien who says that it really does matter, because when there are more women elected, they can pressure the party from within to then lend support to these issues as well. So I think the European case has been quite challenging for people to be able to show this, but the available evidence shows that there does seem to be an influence by women, whether directly or indirectly.
I think it's really tricky to look at substantive representation because we know that women are elected in certain kinds of districts and by certain types of parties. So it's oftentimes impossible to ask, is a woman acting a certain way because she's a woman, or is she acting a certain way because she's in a leftist party, or is she acting a certain way because she's representing a constituency that shares a certain set of beliefs. And so there are, a handful of studies that I think do a decent job at trying to get at this, but I think overall, I'm, I guess, a little bit more skeptical than Mona is about the empirical evidence for substantive representation. And so I would say I'm both often make the argument that what Mona said to the start, which is that we shouldn't be placing any expectations on what women are supposed to do when they get there because they're just supposed to be there. And that in fact, as we expect or hope that the diversity of women increases, if we hope that, for example, women are also going to be represented on the right, that it may actually make it harder in some cases to advance feminist policies. And so sometimes what feminists are hoping for substantively and what advocates of equal descriptive representation might be hoping for are actually not the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So you may have to choose in some cases. And the other point that I'll make is that I think the evidence is really strong that symbolic representation matters. So even if women aren't in fact doing anything differently, I think there's very strong evidence to suggest that who we see in leadership positions matters a great deal to young girls growing up in those places and to the women who live in those places, and to also the attitudes of men and other majority groups and their attitudes and beliefs about women's capacities and capabilities. So having women in these visible positions of power, I think, is really important, even if you end up with the exact same policy.
So I want to, I mean, this is all incredibly fascinating, and there's so much more we can talk about the intricacies, of course, of quotas and representation in Parliament. But I want to maybe switch a little bit and talk about how quotas have been used in other aspects of European societies, namely in sort of the corporate world, to perhaps reach to some of these same, get at some of these same sorts of things that we've been talking about. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Norway now has had quotas on their corporate boards for women for a decade, if I'm correct. So Melanie, I wonder if you could start us talking a bit about kind of the logic behind this, which, perhaps is somewhat similar, but also, perhaps somewhat different, because we're talking about, private corporations and implementing a set of, rules for what their boards look like.
Yeah, I think, I guess my point that I like to make about corporate board quotas in Europe is that it's almost surprising to me that this is the region that is taking leadership of these policies, because I think overall there's been some resistance to especially national quota laws and electoral politics in many European countries. So if you think about Western Europe, I mean, there are plenty of countries that have party level measures, but some of the places that have some of the highest levels of women in politics, like the Nordic countries, don't have national policies. And there's just a handful of places like France and Spain, which also do really well in Europe, that have these national policies, but a lot of other countries have resisted them, or certain factions of those governments have resisted them as anti-democratic. So Norway does not have a national level quota for electoral politics that applies to all parties, but they do have this corporate measure. And there are many countries that have been considering and debating these corporate policies for public boards that have been, it looks like, more resistant to seeing them affecting their own seats, right? So when these legislators are making decisions about what's good for their countries and gender equality, they may be making different decisions about their own elections than they are deciding what might be good for women leaders in the business sector.
Mona, do you want to jump in on that at all?
Yeah, well, yes, it's the first thing to introduce a law regarding gender quotas in corporate boards. And one of the things that came out of the research on political quotas in the 1990s in Norway was this sort of disparity between the share of women elected to political positions, 30 or 40% women, and the fact that there were so few women in positions of leadership in the economic sphere. And so that really led, I think, interest in how that could be done in economic leadership. And so that was the origins of that reform, right? And so since then, there's since the introduction of that provision of 40% at least 40% women, the share of women in the political and economic spheres leadership are roughly the same. I think that what's very interesting in this context is the fact that we talked about before about the sharing of models, and sort of Norway has been very entrepreneurial about promoting this corporate quota leadership model. There's a lot of research on it. The government is very interested in sharing this example. So in 2012, there was a discussion in the European Commission about whether or not there should be some sort of EU-wide regulation that would require all countries to have a corporate quota provision, and that's interesting debates in different countries as well. But there's a growing number of countries that have introduced these provisions, and I think one of the issues that came up in the Europe-wide debate was governments have different levels of ability and willingness to interfere in terms of corporate governance. And so in countries where there is more, how companies operate, some aspects of their structure, it's possible to do that as well. So it's been a little bit different than political quotas, because it's there's some rough parity in terms of across countries in terms of that are faced in terms of introducing those kinds of measures, whereas in business it's much more variable in terms of government intervention in the economy.
Melanie.
Yeah, I would also say what's interesting about some of the quotas that you see at the corporate level is that they vary so much. And part of that, I think, speaks to what Mona was saying. They have to decide what kinds of corporations are going to be included. So sometimes it's made by size. Sometimes it's just, so they make different, it's the entire public sector. So which companies are going to be regulated? And then when do they have to make these decisions? So in the case of elections, you generally have regular elections, right? But different companies fill their boards in different ways. Mm-hmm. So are you only going to talk about new elections, fill some seats? And then if there's really not planned for that sort of turnover. So there's many ways of sort of regulating this that are really difficult when you compare them to electoral quotas. Like one of the most successful aspects of electoral quotas has been party lists, basically, or list requirements, where you say, okay, well, we're going to have this list and women have to be on it in a certain proportion, but that's not really how typically seats get filled for corporate boards. So it creates a lot of added complexity. And the last point I would make is that it's, I think, additionally pretty tricky in this globalized world that we have. So Darren Rosenbluth has some really interesting research on the French case, where he talked about how because many of these corporations are in fact global corporations, instead of recruiting women from France, what they ended up doing is recruiting these women from other countries that already had women on boards. So they would pull, for example, a woman from like a US board who had experience being on the board. So it really wasn't doing anything. I mean, it was in terms of having more women on the board, but for having French women get to participate on these high-level corporate boards, it wasn't having those effects.
Mm-hmm. Really interesting. Are there, I'm just curious, and the answer may be no. Are there other, areas in which quotas are being discussed? We have obviously this long sort of discussion about electoral quotas, the sort of corporate, board discussion we've started to, this has been going on for the last decade or so. I mean, are there other areas or other places where we're seeing this discussion happening?
Yeah, I think you see them now across basically any sort of public institution that you can think of. Mm-hmm. There are some of these countries that have what we can call comprehensive quotas that are actually designed to apply across the board to any sort of position, whether it's elected or unelected. I've been following and collecting data recently on quotas in public administration leadership, which are very few and far between, and there are none of them that I know of in Europe. But there are increasingly some countries that are saying that we have to also look at the state, not just elected officials, but are women having access to leadership in various positions, not just at the sort of high-level ministries, but like the actual people who are there over time, because many of those careers are for life. And in many countries, the public service is the largest employer. And so I see that those debates happening less in Europe than I think I've seen in other contexts, but maybe Mona knows about some that I don't.
Well, the French case is really fascinating. It was in 2014 that they passed a new law on gender equality, and it basically applies it. There's actually a chapter called Generalizing Parity, and it basically puts a parity requirement on all positions of leadership which the state has the capacity to regulate. So it even includes things like the leadership of chambers of commerce, of sports federations. In addition, obviously, there was already a measure for corporate boards. And it's quite fascinating, right? This idea that this is a logic that needs to spread, right? It shouldn't just be something limited to the political sphere. I think one of the things that's been fascinating about the translation aspect is that some of the arguments about why there should be more women in politics have been used in the corporate context, but there's also some differences, because when you're talking about political quotas, it's really about democracy and participation, whereas in the business context, there's really been an argument about the economic benefits of including women. And I mean, there's some parallels between the two sets of debates, but there's some other aspects about, they're more specific to those different spheres.
So we're unfortunately getting towards the end of our time. I want to make sure if anyone has any questions, either here or remotely, that they are answered. Does anyone have any questions at all? Too many things to ask questions about. All right, well, perhaps what we can do is kind of do a round with all of our panelists to kind of give perhaps just some closing thoughts about we've kind of really made a tour of things in the last hour and 20 minutes or so, from beginnings of women getting the vote to now talking about quotas on sports federations and other things. But to give perhaps just some thoughts about kind of where women have come and where obviously where we're going and what still needs to be addressed, whether it's in the political sphere, in the corporate, in civic life, etc. So I'll start with Melanie.
Yeah, so I think there's always two competing stories to tell about women's political participation, right? One of those is a story of tremendous change. If you look at just 100 years ago, women's participation looked very different than it does today. And when we were fighting about women's rights to be equal citizens, then now it seems very taken for granted that gender should not influence someone's citizenship. And so I think that you can take the sort of rosy picture and say, wow, we've come so far in such a short time when you really look at it. But on the other hand, I think we still have far to come, and especially when you're thinking about electoral politics, it's an area of gender inequality that's proved incredibly resistant to change. We see greater inequalities in the political realm than we tend to see in other domains, such as the workforce more broadly and in education. And even in places that do quite well, like Norway's an excellent, or Sweden's an excellent example. It was a long time early suffrage adopter and had a moderately sized suffrage movement. Its long time was a leader in women's political representation until the mid-2000s. But Sweden still never had a woman lead the country as its national leader. So when we think about women's political rights and representation, I think it is important to think holistically about all of these different arenas that we maybe we tend to focus on one thing at a time. But even some of the places that have had the greatest successes in terms of moving towards gender equality, and sometimes faster, still have their first still to come in other arenas.
Karen, do you want to give us your kind of thoughts?
There's so many things to say. First, though, to introduce you to a book. I'm going to pitch this book. It's called The Sensitive Woman. It's by Maria Bucher, who's at Indiana. And it's very, very interesting. It's very personal, and it's very new. So I bring that to your attention.
Great, thank you.
If people
We
want
have a
to know
movie
more
and a
about
book review
the French
section.
suffrage fight, of course, can refer them to a 57-page chapter in my Debating the Woman Question book, which came out in February. In general, though, what I think we can be left with, and in particular in the French case, is that the arguments for suffrage almost entirely were based in arguments of equality indifference, by which I mean the women said we bring something new and different to the table. That's why we should have the vote, because our voices are not being heard. It's all about voices. It's all about the speaking up and having the right to exercise political authority as opposed to working through influence on men. And that's a very significant difference that we're now experiencing. So we need to look at those arguments and see how they were phrased historically. And then as we have marched into the present, how those arguments have changed over time. The parity argument in France, I think, is very interesting because it takes an entirely new twist. And there have been several books about that, which are definitely worth reading. But I want to say in conclusion that I found this discussion very, very interesting, and it's nice to hear from people who are not necessarily in my field about some of these issues. So thank you very much for inviting me to be part of the conversation.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Mona, do you want to offer your final thoughts?
Yeah, so I just want to pick up on some of the things that Melanie was saying about, now we are seeing, more women than ever in positions of political leadership. The current project I'm working on, I guess I've always thought about this. I'm a very optimistic person, thought about this as something that meant we're really seeing a transformation of gender roles and gender norms of leadership. But what we are seeing globally, and we're seeing this sort of new conversation about both resistance and backlash to those gains. And, in the European context, it's mainly in terms of the entry of women into these new, positions of political leadership. And in other parts of the world, it also includes resistance to female voters. So women may have the right to vote, but they're systematically, they're intimidated, they're threatened, they face sexual assault for turning out to the polls. So, this is, I think, a hugely important issue, and particularly in the UK, since the assassination of a female member of parliament in June 2016. The British have seen two new debates. One debate that comes out of the Joe Cox assassination, which is the growing problem of abuse and intimidation of political candidates. And although it's recognized as a problem that's faced by both men and women, everyone seems to agree that it's something that's faced much more by women. So thinking about abuse on Twitter, defacement of campaign posters, threatening phone calls that take on a very sexist and often racist and homophobic tone. Since the emergence of the Me Too movement, we've also seen a new debate on sexual harassment in Parliament. And there's a working group that's had to go back and look at all the procedures that they've had, because there's lots of women inside, political staffers, journalists, political volunteers who have come out with stories of sexual harassment that they've experienced. And so this really shows us that there are these new conversations about women's experiences in political spaces. So they're entering those spaces, but it's not been a seamless process, and it has remained in some respects a very hostile place for women, right? So that, I think, really shows that we really need to keep the pressure on, and to make sure that women actually don't just have the de jure right of equal access, but in real terms, they have a de facto, full and equal enjoyment of their political rights.
I think that's a great place to end. And I wanted to thank our panelists. This was a wonderful conversation. We could obviously continue for quite some time and really get into so many more things, but I think this really was a great conversation of where things started and where we still perhaps need to go. And I wanted to thank all of our audience members, both here in Pittsburgh and remotely as well. And thank you again.
Thank you.